So, Amy, we're here to reflect on 5 years of EnTrade, EnTrade in its current form as a market operator. That journey began with very different starting points from our perspectives in our career, but very common drivers in terms of our interests and vision for EnTrade. From my side, my reflections are my kind of starting point was my background in policy, my time with RSPB, Green Alliance, and then latterly working as an executive, as a Chief Operating Officer at Natural England. My experience of rolling out agri-environment under the European Common Agricultural Policy. And I guess the motivation in particular for me coming into EnTrade and Wessex Water was the opportunity to incentivise landholders and farmers better than the traditional grant scheme, project by project, field by field approach. And I think one of the reflections I'd have on one of the watershed moments early in the days of working out how you would design this sort of two-sided market mechanism was the work we did to profile the environmental services at a catchment scale. So we locked onto the Bristol Avon catchment as a very iconic catchment. A lot of good work and innovation spawned in that catchment, headquarters of the Environment Agency, and so having identified the Bristol Avon catchment as the catchment we would want to profile, we did some really cracking work collaboratively with the Wessex Water team to look at how, if you were to include just one or two additional environmental services beyond something like carbon reduction, carbon sequestration, for something like a woodland creation scheme, you could significantly raise the incentive for a landholder to create a woodland on their land over and above the traditional grant scheme. In this case, I think the England Woodland Creation Offer, which spawned a couple of things. It spawned the basis on which we started to design a multiple service two-sided market in the first place, and its legacy in policy remains the very fact that if you apply for the England Woodland Creation Offer as a landholder, you get that very explicit choice as to whether you're retaining or holding on or transferring the rights to those individual environmental services. You get to tick a box and retain your right to hold on to the nutrient reduction or the biodiversity gain. So that was significant in policy terms, significant in terms of how we went on to think about the financial incentive for a landholder. And I guess I reflect on the ongoing challenge we have actually around the definition of nature markets and really coming right back to where we started and that great collaboration we had with you at the Avon Wildlife Trust. The vision remains and the opportunity remains to provide better financial incentives for farmers and landholders to conserve and restore nature on their land. It is actually as simple as that, right?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, I came at it from a slightly different angle, having been working directly with landowners on the ground for many, many years through agri-environment schemes with Natural England and its founding bodies, but also then through the wildlife trusts and working on the nature reserves, and also, with landowners and with partnerships as well, because that great piece of work that you've just described, that involved the West of England Nature Partnership in some of those early discussions, and they'd done some fantastic work on natural capital mapping and the nature recovery network mapping. So they'd already brought together quite a lot of the data that helped inform some of that early decision making about why you would start with the Bristol Avon catchment and what made the conditions there exactly right. And so I'd sort of come at it from a slightly different perspective. But again, I'd been working with agri-environment schemes and seeing that what brought landowners to the table was a mixture of financial incentives, but also their own intrinsic motivations to actually leave the land in a better state for future generations and to look after their own natural capital on which food production ultimately relies. They need good quality soils and healthy, resilient ecosystems to continue farming. That's really important, particularly when you start looking at the future with climate change and some of the risks that you've got there for farming, the food sector, food and drink sectors, all of those different sectors. There's a need to move. So I came at it from a slightly different perspective, but when our paths crossed when I was at Avon Wildlife Trust, I, like you, was looking for more sustainable long-term funding to deliver these projects that enable nature to recover, nature restoration, but also enable farmers to be involved in that, so that they've got more resilient farming systems that incorporate nature-based solutions and the natural environment in a way that complements what they're already doing. And so we came at it from different perspectives, but very much with the same shared goal for what we wanted to achieve, which was to drive investment into nature recovery projects and to have a resilient landscape within the west of England that actually, for our landscapes to be able to continue to produce food, but also be fantastic places where nature could thrive and move through the landscape. And, we were in a period of significant policy uncertainty around the future of agri-environment funding, future of other funding sources as well. And we were in the pandemic at that point.
100%. So just on that point, then there was that unique moment back in the early days of the lockdown in the first half of 2020 when the world was on pause. And the going back to the case we made for a different way of incentivising nature recovery, an early and very pivotal intervention in that was the proposal that I co-authored with the Broadway Initiative to government for a series of demonstration projects to accelerate the investment, the private investment in nature-based solutions, and using those demonstration projects to inform the evolution of policy. A couple of reflections on that. One is that the case we made back then was predicated on our diagnosis, which was that the barrier to private investment in nature-based solutions wasn't the availability of capital, but was actually the incoherence of the regulation and incentives on the ground, and that it was the opportunity. Secondly, the opportunity to get the design of the post-Brexit environmental framework right, which we were proposing to use the demonstration projects to inform. And sadly, that window has now gone, but nonetheless, the case I think remains that it is the opportunity to design incentive schemes, farm incentive schemes like ELMS in conjunction with private incentives like the water industry natural environment programme, and with some of these very nascent incentives like biodiversity net gain, which is the real opportunity, I think, to drive private investment at scale into nature recovery. From a Wessex Water perspective, because back in 2020 I had that dual role, it was very clear to me that there was that window within the asset management period to work collaboratively with regulators to look at how a water company could deliver its regulated obligations through nature-based solutions at a catchment scale. And I think it's fair to say we've only made very limited progress in enabling us to get those demonstrations up. But the big prize that came from that early phase was, of course, the Green Recovery Challenge Fund.
Yeah.
I'm just recalling that, of course, at that point you were very much part of the process of building what has become a very strong and powerful partnership with the Federation of Wildlife Trusts, but the Avon and Wiltshire Wildlife Trusts in particular in the very early days of forming the partnership that led to the Bristol Avon catchment market. And what were your recollections on the kind of practical challenges around making that case and winning that grant, because you played such a pivotal role in securing that a really important grant in enabling the partnership to get going.
Yeah, I mean, looking back at that, I mean, it was a joint bid, and that was really important because we were bringing together multiple skill sets which needed for these markets to thrive. But I think the very early stages of it, what inspired me to really get involved and what made me think that the Wildlife Trust needed to be at the table was that it was clearly something really different, and it was a fundamental shift in the way that nature recovery projects could be funded. And it was a really significant moment of actually, this is the first time that I had seen something that actually gave me that detailed mechanism for how you actually enable that private investment to then flow to action on the ground. And I think that was the thing that was so inspiring about it, and why I was like, yes, we need to work with EnTrade. We need to work with EnTrade. I knew that EnTrade had already been quite influential in that space, and that had done quite a lot of work around some of the previous market models in the Poole Harbour and places like that. There'd been a lot of work, so I was like, okay, there's expertise there that we don't have as a wildlife trust. As a wildlife trust, we know how to talk to landowners, how to talk to farmers, how to talk to partnerships, how to deliver land management change on the ground. You know, that's wildlife trust bread and butter, is delivery of nature's recovery through nature reserves and through working with other parties. So we had that knowledge and expertise. We also had the knowledge and expertise around baseline surveys. You know, we were building expertise around the use of the metric, the DEFRA metric, which at that point wasn't the statutory metric. It was still very early days. When I look back now at how little we actually knew about how biodiversity net gain was going to be implemented, it was quite limited. Although in the west of England, we'd done quite a bit more work than maybe elsewhere. We'd been there was work being done with WSP and Tom Butterworth on the guidance for biodiversity net gain for the west of England, so getting on the front foot with that a little bit. And you had the consultations were out at the time about how it would work. So we were looking at all of those and thinking how to build the markets around that. But the bid itself was it was a fantastic piece of joint work with EnTrade, and it was obviously during the pandemic as well, so we had the challenges of all working from home, with a lot of us with small children around. So there was quite a few late nights to get that in, and actually we weren't successful with the first bid, if you remember. It was on the second round that we refined what we wanted to do, and we did that off the back of some really helpful feedback on that first round. And sometimes things don't quite pan out how you think they're going to the first time. But that's the joy of innovation, is that it's all about actually learning from it and moving forwards. And that's why actually putting this into practice was so important for me. You know, this was what the Green Recovery Challenge Fund gave us the opportunity to do, was to actually take the market design, the high level market design that you had carefully crafted with through the work with the Broadway Initiative and Wheatley Young Partners. That was so pivotal that you had that high level design. But what the Green Recovery Challenge Fund did was it enabled us the support that we needed to actually implement that in the Bristol Avon, test it, trial it, work out how you implement it. How do you do that on the ground? And I think the background of myself and the team that we put together around that has been really pivotal. So the work with the Wildlife Trust has been really critical in working out how to implement this. How do you specify nature-based projects so that they are transparent, auditable, that you can verify them on the ground? How do you do all of that so that it's done in a way that actually in the future people can look at what you've done and say, yes, actually our investment has been well spent, it's delivering the outcomes that we're expecting it to, the projects are in place? Because there's really important learnings that we've had from things like the carbon market about the need to make sure that projects are delivering genuine environmental improvement on the ground and that they are verifiable. And I think we've overcome a lot of those issues by working with experts and, you know, to design systems and processes that standardise that.
A couple of reflections on that those very early stages of designing the kind of market, the catchment market. The Broadway Initiative spawned the idea, and we spent a bit of time through that proposal, socialising the idea that you need these mechanisms to generate revenues. It's the revenue streams. And I remember very early on the discussions we had with people like Rhianne Marie Thomas at Green Finance Institute. They were really pivotal actually in forming our thinking about actually it's the opportunity to drive those revenues in the environmental services delivered by nature that's going to underpin the scaling of these nature markets. It's not risk. We need to be looking through the opportunity lens at how you incentivise the investment that would address the risk of a lack of resilience in landscapes and catchments to businesses. So that, I think, is something we can point to as a significant success, because we've obviously, through the use cases, we have demonstrated and proven how those revenue streams can be generated.
Absolutely, and it's worked, right?
It's worked 100%.
Yeah.
It's been wildly successful at the point when you had the right regulatory environment and policy environment in place. Go on, sorry.
I was just going to say, we demonstrated that in Somerset.
100%.
You know, the Somerset catchment market, when you had the driver of nutrient neutrality, resulted in over £1 million worth of investment in nature recovery projects and land use change, and a reduction in nutrients entering the Somerset Levels and Moors designated sites that will last in perpetuity. And we've created these incredible wetlands. I mean, the wetland at Curry Rivals, it's fantastic.
Yeah, so we were going to, I mean, in terms of the Somerset market, the driver there was looking at the fact that Wessex Water had a regulated obligation for nutrient reduction. That was the beginning of our application of the catchment market concept in that catchment. And we had some great collaborations with the local teams of the Environment Agency, Natural England, the Wessex team, to unpack that catchment concept and apply it in that nutrient context. Yeah. And the irony, of course, the great irony of that early work was that nutrient neutrality wasn't even a thing in the Somerset Levels and Moors context at that point in time. And it, whilst it became an enormous driver of the energy and resources we put into the application of the concept, the original vision, of course, had been to create that sandbox environment where we could work collaboratively to achieve a common approach to quantifying the benefits of nature-based solutions for nutrient reduction, whether that's for a water company achieving its regulated obligations, or for a housing developer, or indeed for any other buyer of the credit. So I think, again, we can look back and say, well, the project achieved a successful outcome, not just in terms of the fact that it drove over £1 million of nature recovery into nutrient reduction, and has achieved the only on-farm nutrient mitigation wetlands in the country. We've proven the concept. We've proven that just through aggregating SME developer contributions alone, you can finance. Yeah. You can channel private investment into the establishment of these farm-led nature recovery projects, but also the evolution of the nutrient reduction standard as something that is now recognised as being nationally leading in providing that regulatory certainty for the Environment Agency and Natural England.
Well, yeah, and actually that's something that I think that you and I are both incredibly proud of about the work that EnTrade and particularly, you know, Jeremy Graham is just done a fantastic piece of work along with Lou from Arup to pull together the nutrient reduction standard. It's a really, really strong piece of work. And developing that standard, we learnt, so through the Somerset catchment market, not only have we learnt how you develop an H market and implement an H market, but how you develop those standards that are needed for that transparent quantification of the services, and how those standards could be developed in a way that enables things like stacking to occur. And the recent work that Jeremy's done with the Scientific Advisory Group, so the Water Quality Subgroup, who are advising the Environmental Markets Board, you know, we've had a group of academics really delving into that standard. And then also the recognition that we had from Natural England around the quantification of nutrient reduction from buffer strips, riparian buffer strips, that the standard also does. That's a fantastic piece of work. So it's a robust, deliverable standard that actually does what it needs to, and it enables other environmental services to be quantified alongside it. So those wetlands that we've delivered in Somerset, they're not only going to deliver that nutrient reduction, they also deliver biodiversity gain as well. And we're just in the process of going out and reapplying the standard to see whether or not our original assumptions on the biodiversity net gain were right or not. So that will be a really interesting thing that will come out over the next couple of weeks as well from that. I think going back to the, again, thinking about what's been really successful about those wetlands is that they've given us something that we can really demonstrate to landowners, to policymakers, to decision makers in that space. And we've obviously had site visits with lots of different people over the last couple of weeks. And this is something that's, I think really important to both you and I is how we share the knowledge that we've gained.
Yeah, 100%.
How do we share that knowledge around the development of the standards? How do we share the knowledge about the implementation of the projects, the actual operation of the markets? How do we do that? So, I mean, having the NFU out on site was really, really great back in September, and talking to them about the legal framework that we use, because obviously that's been another important part of the story, has been how we've developed that legal framework. And when we started that work, you know, conservation covenants and responsible bodies were not quite a thing yet. We knew they were coming, but we didn't know what shape they were going to be in. And since then, you've had really fantastic work done by the responsible bodies that do exist. We recently saw the publication of RSK's conservation covenant, so that they're sharing their learning and knowledge as well. And
yes. We should talk some more about the contracts and the legal framework, but just one other reflection on the early stages of developing the catchment market concept at that very holistic kind of conceptual level. We talked about the revenue streams, but the other aspect of that work was the work we did to look across the globe at successful environmental markets. So the idea of the catchment market design didn't evolve in isolation. It was grounded in a very significant piece of work we did to look across a range of different jurisdictions at other environmental markets, where markets had proven to drive efficient investment in environmental delivery. So we looked at markets for energy efficiency, for example, in Italy. We looked at renewable energy markets in particular. We looked at markets for air quality improvement, and the common features of those markets were certainly the requirement for standardisation and not just of the environmental services, but also the contracts to enable efficient trading to occur, the aggregation of developers and of supply and demand. But also crucially the requirement for market intermediaries to play that role in bringing together suppliers and buyers, which has led us then to that really clear focus on what EnTrade is. And it's been a difficult one, this, because it's been on such a long innovation journey, and its origins back in the Poole Harbour catchment as a piece of innovation by the Wessex Water Catchment Delivery Team, a one-sided payment for ecosystem services market mechanism, very innovative of its time, but it's been a very long innovation journey from those days to where it is now, positioned very clearly as a market operator. We think probably unique in the world, but crucially playing that role as a central counterparty to enable efficient and trading and to occur between the buyers of the environmental credits with the landholders supplying the nature-based projects. That has been a really significant evolution of the EnTrade model, and I recall very early on in this process references to what is EnTrade going to be when it grows up, and it is now very clear we've really crystallised that role, and it's proven itself in respect of the value it creates by de-risking the participation in these markets by the credit buyers and the landholders, right?
And that's a role that's really valued by others. You know, that's something that comes through in the conversations we have with landowners who work with us, with the NFU who work with us, about being that really trusted intermediary that doesn't have an interest in the price that's paid for biodiversity units or nutrient credits. You know, we operate the fee-for-service model so that we can generate an income to support the activities, but by not having an interest in that, we're not like a broker or a trader where maybe we might have an interest in a higher price. It's about finding the right price so that it's a fair price paid by buyers and a fair price paid to suppliers. So that's a unique aspect of EnTrade. But actually the roles that we play, defining those roles is really important, and it's really important for a number of reasons. Some of that is around actually transparency and being a high integrity market operator. You know, that's really important to us. And so there've been roles that maybe we've needed to play in some of the early markets that perhaps as a market operator in the future we might not look to play those roles ourselves, but it's been a necessity of development and innovation. So things like, being the standards organisation for the nutrient reduction standard, actually as a market operator that might not be the ideal model. It might be preferable to have that as an independent. We're not the standards body for the biodiversity metric, for example. That very firmly sits with DEFRA, but we use it and apply it in the market, and that's an example of where our role maybe needs to evolve into the future. But also things around certification and verification. So quantifying the benefits from these projects, again, that might be something that's better done by somebody else. Verification, often it's better for that to be independent, so that we can have that build that trust and confidence in the market that the projects are delivering genuine outcomes. But we've had to play quite a lot of extra roles. We've also had to bring together this amazing collaboration, right, of all these different people, because nature markets are complex beasts. They require different skill sets, don't they?
Yeah. I mean, there's two sides of the same coin, really. There's you're absolutely right. In the absence of the skills and capabilities that existed at the point when we were beginning this innovation, we've had to play quite significant range of those roles and capabilities. But the long-term vision, I think, for these markets, and it started to reflect itself, I think, in the use cases we've generated, is to grow those skills. Right. So there's the role in particular, I'd be fascinated to hear more about your reflections, having started in the Wildlife Trust and then come to EnTrade. How you see those capabilities and skills base growing within the Wildlife Trust as a project developer, because for me that's the long-term opportunity here. Is actually an economic opportunity to grow a whole new approach to incentivising and monitoring and enforcing nature recovery, the financing nature recovery on the ground, and that's a skill set that is only disparately available on the ground. But I mean, just reflecting on where we've seen the role of the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust in particular go as a project developer, how significant has that journey been for them?
Absolutely pivotal. And the journey we've been on has been, quite multi-layered. So actually there's been developing those skills and engaging landowners for a start, and making sure that actually there's a key understanding of how you build these projects, and the need to recognise you have to understand the agricultural context that these projects are going to be delivered in. For a start, you need to understand a bit about farm business. So there's been the need to sort of have a little bit of upskilling in that, to enable good design of projects that are going to be easy for landowners to deliver, because if it's too complicated, too difficult, or you don't have the machinery, it becomes very difficult to maintain these projects in the long term. But also the ecological skills. There's been a real shortage of ecologists, and some of the recent graduates were coming out of COVID without the on the ground skills. They hadn't been given the opportunity they would have been in their normal degree courses to go out and do surveys and things. So we actually ran that really successful placement scheme with the Wildlife Trust, and we had I think it was 8 placements and 4 Kickstarters. The Kickstarters were out doing land management skills, the practical application on the ground, and then the placements, they were looking at how you quantify the environmental services, so application of the biodiversity metric, and that is something that has been absolutely world class with the Wildlife Trust. The understanding that team now have of how you apply the metric in not only on the ground but in a market context, and how you design projects in a market context, because there's no point in designing projects for which there's no demand. There has to be demand. There are things you need to think about if you're putting projects to a market that maybe you wouldn't think about if you were putting them forwards for grant funding, or it's a different approach that's needed. And the skill sets as well, looking at different environmental services, so having them thinking about, well, how can you generate multiple environmental services? That changes how you design a project. Project design for multiple environmental services is very different to project design for a single service. If you think about designing for carbon, a woodland designed purely for carbon is going to look very, very different to a woodland that's designed for biodiversity, carbon and nutrient reduction. That's a very different thing. I mean, obviously you can't stack carbon and biodiversity yet. That's a real challenge. But and all of this was being done with the Wildlife Trust in the context of needing to understand some of those intricacies of markets around whether or not you can sell multiple services from the same project. So is stacking possible or not? Or are they being sold as a bundle? You know, there's a lot to think about. How do you design a project that and specify that project in a way that is contractable? How do you make that legally enforceable? How do you make that verifiable? You know, there's a lot to think about there. And then having to fit that within regulations that were still in the process of being designed and implemented. Again, we started this process before biodiversity net gain was a regulatory requirement.
So that early vision that was really locked into the Green Recovery Challenge Fund bid actually for driving a different approach to financing nature recovery and regional economic growth, I think has been proven actually in the use cases. I mean, one of the greatest sources of pride I have from the legacy of the EnTrade innovation in the Bristol Avon catchment market is undoubtedly the skills and the confidence that I've seen grow in the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust and the team of ecologists run by Chelsea in their approach to developing these projects and understanding the market, the value of the market mechanism. And that's just, I think, a microcosm of the opportunity, the potential that could be unlocked across the country if we get the right enablers in place. There's also the benefits of these markets, and an ongoing frustration I have, I think, is the conflation of the experience of the voluntary carbon market with the expectation of what these nature markets are about. And I think it is a comparison of apples to pears in my mind's eye. The voluntary carbon market has been established to enable trading in a global commodity, in this case, you know, tons of carbon sequestered. These markets should be about the efficient allocation of private and public funding to deliver the greatest environmental, economic and social benefit. And if you think about the experience of our use cases, they are borne out. Where these markets are well designed and well governed, they're simply tools to enable that allocation of funding to the best possible projects in the best possible places, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Think about the co-benefits that's unlocked. You've already touched on the fact that the wetland projects are delivered biodiversity gain, still potentially to be valued and resold to the landholder in that case, but also co-benefits that will probably never be realised and monetised in terms of the downstream flooding benefits to the reduction of the flooding to the local community, the amenity benefits that are already being experienced by the local villagers because they have a right of way that runs alongside that wetland. The housing
now an improved bridge that goes across
indeed,
where it was previously a bit more of a plank.
Quite, and then the local developments unlocked. You know, it's SME developers who've had their developments unlocked, care homes who've had their developments unlocked. So by definition, these are community benefits that these markets, if they're well designed, will unlock on the ground beyond the nature recovery, right?
But they need support from a wide range of people, including local government. You know, developing these markets is far easier if you can work closely with your local planning authority. So you need strong resources in those areas as well. And the recent establishment of the Cornwall Link Nature Market has proven that where you've got a progressive, forward-thinking local planning authority, you can actually adapt what we've done with these early demonstration projects and get them delivered really quite quickly. You know, we moved within 6 months to having a functional market with registered supply, registered demand. That's you know, moved forwards very, very quickly. And again, that was because you had a progressive local planning authority, but also a very strong local partnership. So these local nature recovery partnerships actually can be really pivotal in establishing some of these mechanisms and helping get them off the ground. I think that really struck me when I was at the recent Cornwall and Isles of Scilly Local Nature Partnership Conference, was actually how important it is for people to come together. If you want to innovate, you need a lot of different skill sets. You need the right market conditions, but you also need to bring together all those different people. I think there was quite a few things that you touched on just now about the multiple benefits of these projects, but also about learning from the carbon markets. And earlier on you were saying about how these demonstration projects have come through looking at what's worked well and what's consistently part of market design in other nature markets. But I think also that learning from what's failed is so important. Actually, failure in innovation is really important if it's then looked at and understood, and then solutions put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen again. So some of those well-publicised failures of the carbon markets, that's made it harder to build trust and confidence in these nature markets, but it's also given us a clear steer on what needed to be designed in from the start, which was one of the reasons for getting involved in these markets right in the early days, was to make sure that they were properly designed, they had been properly thought through. And again, it was one of the things that really inspired me to get involved with the Bristol catchment market, was making sure that that investment stays local, particularly when you're talking about biodiversity loss, because actually without these mechanisms, it's very difficult to ensure that the investment, where there's habitat loss, that then the investment into the gain that comes with that through biodiversity net gain is kept as local as possible, and that is important. What we don't want to see is some areas of the country becoming more nature depleted because actually the investment is going elsewhere. So it is important that it's local.
On the role of local authorities, my concern about mechanisms like the local nature recovery strategies has always been, and we've been around long enough in our careers to have seen many predecessor equivalents and plans and maps. And I go back to my experience in Natural England, where I saw some really first-class work invested in the targeting of environmental stewardship.
Yes.
To a degree, founder on the reality of the economic incentives, the financial incentives available to a farm advisor on the ground. What do local authorities? What role can have we based on our use cases?
Yeah.
What role can local authorities play most usefully in enabling their local nature recovery strategies become a tool that can realise real change on the ground?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and I think such an important one, because local authorities have been experimenting with the different roles that they can play, and in some cases almost establishing themselves in that market operator role of trying to operate credit schemes and things. And actually that's maybe not where their main role and capabilities lie. And actually it can be really challenging if they do move into that space. They can end up with all sorts of conflicts of interest as well. So, actually they need to really be thinking about what role can they play in this space. And one of them is fundamentally making sure that some of the drivers that are driving demand in this space are properly implemented. So the implementation of biodiversity net gain as a policy, making sure that that's well implemented, that has to be a fundamental role for local authorities. But also thinking about actually what outcomes do they want from that policy. So how they implement biodiversity net gain will determine how much investment goes into the local nature recovery strategies. We did a piece of work with Arup looking at demand in the nature markets, and we were trying to look at, well, what impact would it have if local authorities started setting policies around how much mitigation occurs on site within a development versus off site on a separate biodiversity net gain project, or look through a market like ours. And actually what we found was that it makes a significant difference how that's implemented as to the level of investment that would then go in to delivery of local nature recovery strategies. If you just put everything on site and nothing off site, that's fine in some ways. Actually development can be a really positive thing. Some of the land that gets developed, it's actually a bit of a desert when it comes to the natural world. You're actually almost better having a development to generate more habitat on that site, but that habitat will always have a level of disturbance that you might not have off-site, so you might have more benefits doing that off-site. Off-site, you can also start to deliver some of those local nature recovery strategy priorities. And certainly what we did through that analysis that we did initially, we also looked at, well, what's the difference between 10% biodiversity net gain and 20% biodiversity net gain? And actually, in terms of the number of biodiversity units that developers would have to purchase for 20% versus 10%, not that big a difference between the two. So there's policy decisions that local authorities can take that can help drive investment into the local nature recovery strategies. They can think about, well, actually, we want to maybe see 50% of biodiversity net gain done off-site, so that 50% of that investment goes into other areas and the local nature recovery strategy. In the future, maybe if we can really make biodiversity net gain work at 10%, fantastic to see an uplift to 20%. But those local policy decisions matter. So taking those decisions, implementing them, and making sure that developers have the support that they need. This is new for developers as well, right? So they're still working out what the right approach is to biodiversity net gain. But we're seeing some real leaders coming out in this space now, some developers that are actually really starting to realise that people that come to live in their developments want to live in a nature-rich space, and they want to feel that the house that they're buying has contributed towards actually some of that biodiversity net gain in the wider landscape. So there's benefits to the developers too. But going back to the role of local authorities, driving demand has got to be a critical one. I think anything that they can be doing to think about that.
Driving and aggregating demand, there has to be a role for combined authorities there as well, presumably, in enabling the role of local authorities locally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And playing to their strengths as planning authorities, fundamentally, and building capacity and capability as planning authorities has to be key, right?
Yeah. I mean, and that is a real challenge for local authorities at the moment. You know, there is a shortage of planners nationally. There's a shortage of the skill sets needed and the capabilities within local authorities. And, you know, the finances have just simply not been there. So they're dealing with a lot of challenges at the moment. And I think that's where actually enabling them to be much more focused on what their role is important, because that will help. And that's one of the things that we've tried to do actually, is we have upskilled planners. So we've presented to planning teams within all the local authorities that we've worked within. We've presented to their planners, their heads of planning, a wide range of different people working within that sort of space actually. And that knowledge share is so important. We ran that huge event. Do you remember when we took over half of the National Trust headquarters in Swindon to share the knowledge and the learning from the Bristol Avon catchment market? That was a fantastic event. Brought lots of different people together from different backgrounds.
Yeah, no, some really great conversations, great breakouts with the local authority representatives in particular. I do recall very vividly, illustrating again the benefit of actually having some real world use cases that people can actually focus on to understand what's worked well and what's worked less well. Going back to the skills, we've had to grow a lot of skills kind of in-house in the absence of those skills on the ground. We've talked about how we've seen the role of our partners in growing those skills. One of the main ways we've overcome some of those issues, I think, in the early days of EnTrade was establishing those really strong partnerships. And I think one of the most significant reflections on the journey we've been on is the importance of some of our partners to getting us to this point. We would not be here if it weren't for certainly some of the really important partnerships we established in the very early days during COVID, which really enabled the ways of working that established themselves in the early days of that lockdown was obviously everybody was online, everybody was working virtually, and therefore we were able to reach out globally. We were actually able to talk to people across the world and tap into their own experience. We talked to DC Water about their SUDS scheme. We spoke to Australian water authorities about their experience of innovation on catchment delivery. One of the most important partnerships that evolved in that early phase was the work we established with David Young as a former founding director of Natural England, and somebody who had worked in a regulated market context, particularly energy, to bring some of that experience to the design of the market, of the catchment market, and the market instruments and legal legal framework that has evolved to apply in the use cases.
Well, it's like building anything. You need an architect, and then you need a whole lot of different trades and expertise to then put that design into place, I think. And, you know, the relationship with Osborne Clarke around the legal framework, that's been a really important one. And, you know, other legal firms that we've worked with as well, you know, there's been Freese, but there's also been, you know, some of the work that was done with the NFU and their local legal representatives as well, to make sure that our legal framework was balanced. But also, you know, the Home Builders Federation.
Yeah, I mean, just on the legal framework, huge challenges you've grappled with in the absence of those standardised contracts, which are now just starting to emerge. In the absence of that, the legal framework and the individual legal instruments within that framework have been tested to destruction. But brilliant conversations with individual landholders, with their legal representatives, just to kind of understand, well, how do you get that balance right between a legal framework which is transparent, which is fair, which is providing that level of certainty, but also, in particular, through the lens of a family or tenant farmer, providing is easy to understand and relatively easy to access. That's been absolutely pivotal. And yeah, absolutely. The countless conversations you've had with lawyers. I don't know how many lawyers have you spoken to in the process developing that legal framework.
I think it's 21 now. The count is up to. It's around about 21
different law firms.
Different lawyers. Different lawyers. The law firms is a bit less. But again, that's because the way the nature markets are, they straddle different legal disciplines. So it's not just environmental law. You know, there's the laws around land acquisition and rights to land. There's the procurement side of things. There's all the sort of commercial aspects to it, and then there's tax and the financial law, and you know, there's a whole range of different expertise and planning law that we've had to bring together around that. And it's one of the things that Osborne Clarke have done really well for us, is to be able to draw in those different disciplines when they're needed. And Caroline Bush has been fantastic, you know.
She's a star.
Yeah, she's absolutely brilliant, and loved working with them. And I've loved all the discussions with the lawyers, actually, because the legal framework's so important in terms of making sure everybody understands their roles and responsibilities, their commitments, their obligations, how and when they're going to get paid. You know, all of these different structures is so important. And then how we will approach things when things go wrong. You know, you've got to, and I think this is something that can be really hard to do and do well, because no one wants to think about what happens when things go wrong. But legal frameworks are well-designed legal frameworks protect everybody when things go wrong.
Well, particularly in an embryonic market, when you're grappling with that fundamental lack of certainty around even what the status of environmental credit is. At the moment, we still default to common law, right? So that's something pretty critical that needs fixing pretty damn quickly. But I think the attributes of the law firms that we've worked closely with have been that their ability to bring together the different specialist practices, the corporate lawyers, the environmental lawyers with the planning lawyers, in the absence of the legal that legal certainty nationally, they've brought together different practices to inform how the market rules work in conjunction with the legal framework that you've designed. And secondly, that kind of vision, they've shared that vision for how these markets could actually be driving a whole new development of a whole new series of capabilities, driving economic growth in conjunction with nature recovery. It's that shared vision, I think, which has been really critical.
Well, the legal framework absolutely starts with market rules, which I think leads us on to something we haven't really talked about, which is the governance of the market, which is really important in terms of that transparency piece in particular, but also having someone hold us to account is really important if we're to run high integrity markets. It's
fascinating. If I look back at 2020, some of the very academic conceptual conversations we had about we'll need an arm's length body, we'll need independent oversight, we'll need a scientific advisory group, we'll need some of those capabilities to enable us to calibrate the standards that we were having to write ourselves in the absence of that of those standards nationally, in the absence of that oversight nationally. It's been a long process to get to where we have now, but we have nonetheless, because we had those market rules in place from very early on, courtesy of David Young. We had the we had the benefit of those use cases to get us to the point where we had projects that meant that we had that requirement to have that independent, of that arm's length oversight of how we were then securing the benefits. And you're right, I would say it's not always been comfortable, but I'm immensely grateful to the individuals who have made their skills and knowledge available, and we've brought through that Environmental Markets Board the different capabilities required to oversee a market operator like EnTrade. And it hasn't always been easy, because of course we're a very embryonic market operator, operating in a very embryonic market. But the combination of that governance mechanism driving compliance with the market rules has not only brought the capabilities in EnTrade to the point where I think we can be very confident in our ability to operate, but also that continuous improvement culture, which I think I'm so proud of actually in the team, that we've been able to bring in external auditors and utilise the skills of soil association certification in enabling us to get to the really critical things that need us to grow our capabilities and embrace that learning as a team has been brilliant. Given the very significant contrast between the kind of schemes, the investment, the kind of schemes that the soil association certification team have been used to working with, and our starting point as a very embryonic market operator, I'm super proud of how we've come on in that respect.
Well, and fascinatingly, all those skill sets and capabilities that soil association certification had to build to do our audit as well.
Yes.
You know, they had the right background, and there was lots of parallels with what they were already doing with some of the other schemes, but it wasn't the same. We were something new and different. And in the audit world, the capabilities don't quite exist there yet.
You need
for
a
us.
starting point.
Yeah, so soil association certification have been really great at helping us develop that starting point. They took the audit guideline that was developed with the Environmental Markets Board and implemented it. Now they've had to draw on experience from ISO and other things to try and come up with something that was practically going to work. And we're still refining that process. And we're now on to the next stage of that with BSI being an early adopter of the Flex standards for nature markets, which is really exciting. And you know, might not be everyone's cup of tea to get excited about audits, but actually that does really excite the EnTrade team because of that opportunity to look at what we're doing, really analyse it and say, okay, how can we improve? Where do we need to make this better? How do we make sure that we are always operating in a way that is high integrity, so transparent, efficient, effective? You know, actually all of that comes through continuous improvement.
100%.
And each audit we have, we do better each time. And this year's audit with Soil Association certification, they really complimented us on the pace of change and the pace of improvement. It's not just about making those improvements, it's about how quickly you put them in place as well. And that we are faster than most in that space, which is great. And again, that comes back to the nature and culture of the team to be innovative. We do work at pace. We don't necessarily wait to have all the answers to try something. And I think that's really important for innovation. I think if you wait for government to tell you all the answers, you'll be waiting a very long time. You know, that's not how nature markets are going to evolve. They're going to evolve through actually a bottom-up approach as well as the top-down. We need the top-down still. We need the regulation. We need the guidance, we need all of that, but I think these things evolve better when they are first of all taken forward by industry, and we now need to, with governance, that's the next step.
That's right. I think we're at that point now where we've established, we've gone as far as you can through voluntary sector. Through voluntary action by the private sector alone. We've got to the point where, and the use cases exemplify that. There is some learning, but it's clear from the conversations that are happening around tables nationally that the financial and business sector won't act without the leadership by government now required to establish mechanisms that will create confidence, their confidence in the integrity of these markets. There's deep concerns about the well-publicised failings from the voluntary carbon market, and an expectation, therefore, that government has to step into that space. So I think the experience of the Environmental Markets Board regulating the EnTrade markets illustrates and points to what needs to be put in place now to establish metrics and standards that have legal underpinning nationally, and the need for that mechanism and process for not only evolving those standards as you generate evidence and science to prove them in the real world, but also to authorise market intermediaries like EnTrade to go out and use those standards. In the absence of those processes nationally, it's been very hard to get these use cases off the ground, and that comes back to your central point that there is just no substitute for going out and trying in the real world. And we talked about a regulatory sandbox, a bit of jargon out the tech world, some great work by the Environmental Innovation Policy Centre in the US talking about sandboxing nature, which has been something of a kind of guiding philosophy for what we've done. But I would concur completely that our experience suggests that to inform how policy and regulation needs to evolve and how government establishes that momentum and leadership for the private sector, there's no substitute for those controlled environments where the private sector can work collaboratively with the voluntary sector, with regulators, with local authorities to test and learn in the real world.
Well, the big prize out of all of that is being able to combine all of these different impact streams, different private investment streams, into something that can have real impact on the ground. Because actually then you start to be able to bring together public and private finance. You can't do it if we continue business as usual, Wild West as people. I don't really like describing it as the Wild West because I think that that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and I think we don't want a Wild West because we want space to innovate and space to do things differently. We don't want to be too constrained, but at the same time we don't want to have those very public failings of the carbon markets. We want the nature markets to succeed, and that needs the right market conditions, which does include regulation and oversight. It's really important.
Brings us perhaps to the role of our partnership with the University of Exeter in enabling us to achieve the mechanism that gets the fair and efficient matching of buyer demand to supplier offers. Again, one of those very early partnerships. We had actually a history of collaboration with Professor Brett Day, and Professor Luke Lindsay, and the team at the University of Exeter in EnTrade that predated the work on the catchment markets. But it was the very early conversations we had about market design that then catalysed the collaboration around the use of the brilliant work led by Luke Lindsay to look at a Nobel Prize winning piece of economics, the Shapley value, and apply that to environmental land management context. And the joy of that partnership was that work. Luke had done the heavy lifting on that work conceptually. EnTrade brought the use cases that enabled Luke to apply that in the real and test that algorithm in the real world, right? And that's been pivotal to the use cases we've generated to this point.
And that opportunity to work with Luke on coding things like the biodiversity trading rules for biodiversity net gain into that mechanism, which is a really interesting piece to do. And we just recently tested those assumptions that are coded in with Arup, with Tom Butterworth, and concluded that actually the assumptions we put in place are the right ones. There are some things that you can't codify, but that's okay. I've learnt so much from working with the University of Exeter. They bring together this wonderful mix of economics and ecology that, actually that's been really helpful. And, you've had Ben Balmford involved as well, who's, he's an ecologist as well as economics expert. So, that combination is really helpful. And you need to bring together all those different people. And then the next step from that has been the development of the platform as well. So obviously EnTrade has a history of having digital platforms that help have easy engagement with landowners, easy engagement with buyers, makes it easy for everybody to come forward for their different parts of the market. But the new platform that we've needed to develop for these two-sided markets has been a very different beast to the previous platform. And, you know, having to develop things like the registries that are our secure vault for those credits that we're generating, you know, that's been quite an interesting experience. And going through that with Radical IT, we had endless research sessions going through the intricacies of this. And it makes you think about how you're doing things in a level of detail when you need to put it into a piece of software that maybe you've thought about it but not really thought through every step you've got to go through. So I think that's been fundamental in shaping our thinking around how the credit registries, the project registries, and then the market participant registries, how those need to work and how they interact together, and how all of that sits together in this digital vault that is behind what everybody sees as an easy to use front end system where you can upload your projects, you can upload your metric because you've got a credit requirement, whatever it is. And we're making it really easy for those participants. There's a lot of complexity that sits behind that the use of digital tools can really help us move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. The vision was always for the digital infrastructure, both to secure the environmental benefits and, as you say, to enable the tracking of the environmental credits from cradle to grave.
Important.
Absolutely. And also then to automate and to enable the scale, the bringing together of multiple suppliers and buyers simultaneously in multiple geographies to deliver multiple environmental services. That's the sort of complexity that can only be unlocked through digital infrastructure. So I think the sequencing was we've obviously developed the legal framework and the IP kind of manually. That's been a long and exhaustive process to get us to the point where we have applied it in the real world and generated these use cases. And then it was the partnership with Arup and then Radical IT, just a first class group of IT developers who taught us Agile and enabled us to work with Agile to build the platform out based on that manual IP. That was the sequencing that I think my big reflection on the learning from the digital platform was we couldn't have got there without everything that had gone before it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, the understanding that we now have, I think in terms of the last 3 years, I don't think I've ever had a period of my life where I learnt as much as quickly as I have done over the last 3 years. It's been intense without a doubt, but really exciting and really interesting, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. Actually, it's been, hard at times, and we've felt like we were in the early days. We were quite far ahead, and we had to explain ourselves a lot, and I think that
less so now.
Yeah,
still
less
having
so
to explain
now.
ourselves,
Yeah.
but less so.
Yeah, and actually that's been one of the journeys that we've been on, is how do we explain ourselves in this environment where there is a lot of complexity and technical jargon and, lots of legal, economic, environmental, that's a mesh of a lot of different languages. How do you get to a common language that can be shared and explained, and that people can engage with these markets? And that's where market operators are so important. We take a lot of the complexity and make it simple, and I think that's really important.
Yeah. There's also a trust thing. There's a lot of noise in this space. There's lots of excitement and energy and anticipation, but there is also a lot of, I would say, misinformation, or certainly a lack of shared language, which I think means that people miss one another.
Yeah.
And that then comes back to the importance of getting on and building use cases that build trust and build confidence. And I think that's why the EnTrade use cases will point to the evolution of policy and market governance in particular going forward. but also I hope engendering that spirit of collaboration which has got us to this point. Somebody observed to me just the other day that it was only when the market leaders started collaborating that the UK solar industry really started to motor, and I think it's only through the pioneers and innovators that we know that we share across the country, that it's only through establishing that common platform for collaboration that we're going to see the nature market agenda moving forward, because we've with the best will in the world, whilst we've achieved a lot in 5 years, we've not seen that momentum and energy replicated nationally in terms of how policy and regulations evolved in conjunction with what's happening on the ground, right?
Yeah, and I think that collaboration is so important to us, and I think that's where the sort of knowledge share that we're trying to do is really important. We've got the new library site that has got a lot of documents on it and a lot of the information about how we're doing all of this that can be made available. You know, we're putting as much out there as possible. It's been our blog series, which has brought together all of the different collaborators that we've worked with over that time to share their reflections. Yeah. And I think, you know, putting as much out there as possible. I think there's a lot of players in this space who are feeling similarly. So, you know, that publication of RSK's Conservation Covenant, they're really keen to collaborate and make things work. And I think the BSI standards work, bringing together a number of us who are early adopters of the BSI to share our learning, and there's going to be quite a lot of sharing around that. So sharing externally as well as sharing amongst the group, and you've got a whole new nature standards hub that's been set up to enable easy sharing of use cases. The work that GFI have been doing around case studies, and you know, we've contributed to that as well, and some of their documents where we can. So I think putting as much out there as possible to share what we've done, how we've done it, is going to be really important over the next couple of years. And I'm hoping that people will be looking at that, interrogating that, and actually, if people are replicating what we're doing, that's a real success, right?
That's success for us, absolutely. I think the enduring legacy of these use cases and of the EnTrade market model, I hope, will be that others will follow, and that policy will enable the replication and scaling of the high integrity market model that we've proven in the catchment markets. Yes, another significant partnership is is of course with Arup. That's been quite a journey from the origins, which was where we came across one another in a tender for a government project, and there was a bit of jockeying for position and a bit of concern that they were kind of, are they a competitor or are they a collaborator, and then realising that they had complementary expertise and a huge amount of admiration for the model that we developed. I think the components of that partnership have been the cultural fit, I guess, of that kind of vision for how these nature markets could disrupt and improve approaches to business as usual approaches to financing nature recovery. But also the existence of their ventures function, the fact that they had that experience of working with startups across the globe, all largely, I think, in a product space rather than a services space. But nonetheless, they had that team with that experience of working with small startups, bringing the Arup culture, bringing the Arup expertise to those ventures, which has brought us through a whole succession of collaborations to the point where they wanted to invest in EnTrade, and we've now achieved that, I think, real watershed moment where we launched EnTrade Limited in joint venture between YTL UK and Arup, and that ongoing role that Arup plays in bringing their expertise, particularly in the digital space, as well as their conviction and confidence and faith in the model, has been so important to getting us to this point.
Absolutely.
Right.
Good point to start.
I think so. I'm
Yes.
running out of steam, and well, I certainly need a comfort break. I don't know
Yeah.
about you, Amy.
So, Guy, over the summer we've been really busy, haven't we, with policy consultations and working really hard to contribute to a whole raft of different consultations that have been out there. And I think that's been one of the really important things about our demonstrations is their contribution to policy and regulation and how they can help inform that. How do you see that shaping up, and what do you think? Where do you think that focus needs to be next?
Yeah, so we very consciously set out with a strategy to innovate and demonstrate bottom up, as you say, which is what's got us to the use cases we're so proud of. But in conjunction with that, to influence and collaborate top down nationally, to inform how policy could evolve to scale these nature markets. And I think we have achieved some progress in that time.
Yeah.
So if I reflect on the starting point was the Broadway Initiative proposal, and that was this diagnosis of the barriers to private investment in nature recovery, not availability of private capital, but the incoherence of regulation and incentives on the ground, and critically the need for a policy framework that would enable liquidity, scale and certainty to get the project pipeline moving and attract institutional investors to these markets. So that was the sort of diagnosis. The appeal on government to put forward public funding to de-risk the private investment to establish those projects as a demonstration at an investment scale, I think remains still to be taken up. Hold that thought.
Yeah.
But the diagnosis, I think, has been proven and explicitly built upon in successive reports and through policy. I think that led then to the Financing Nature Recovery work that was published in 2023, the partnership between the Broadway Initiative with the Green Finance Institute and Finance Earth, and a whole range of experts, 300 individual experts fed into the work that then created what I still maintain is the blueprint actually for what a high integrity, well-governed nature market looks like, and how that market should be designed, how it should be governed, how it should be operated, and importantly, the clarity of what the role of government should be in building the market infrastructures, establishing the independent system of oversight is still a big gap in the policy framework. We have the nature markets framework as a response clearly to the Financing Nature Recovery blueprint. And then subsequent to that, the work of the UK Nature Markets Dialogue, which we've obviously fed into, but Broadway Initiative has done a cracking job of catalysing through its steering group to enable that pan-economy blueprint for government, and the consensus that has led to, which is that there's that requirement for that independent system of oversight with those legally underpinning metrics and standards to scale these nature markets, and critically that consensus actually that integrity is what will unlock scale. We won't get to high integrity markets if we attempt to scale too soon. So I think those are all good milestones in this roadmap we're on towards a policy framework, a government response to the innovation and the energy that's being catalysed on the ground through these bottom-up startups and collaborations. There's at EnTrade, I think we can be proud of the fact that we've been a very significant contributor to all of those different outputs, and we've obviously, and you've been at the forefront of this, Amy. We've contributed to every consultation over these last 6 to 9 months that's relevant to the evidence that government is clearly trying to gather to satisfy itself on how it can evolve policy to create that certainty. The work on biodiversity net gain and the exemptions that have created a lot of uncertainty and has clearly cooled demand in the use case in the live pilot markets we're running. The call for evidence over the summer on how we can expand the role of the private sector in nature recovery, and some of the work we've been doing on individual bits of legislation, Levelling Up Act and the Planning and Infrastructure Bill latterly. It all takes me, I think, back to where I started. I think there's clearly still a big requirement for government to set out that coherent policy framework that will establish certainty for the demand side in the integrity of these markets and the mechanisms that are being created bottom up by the likes of EnTrade, and that the projects are being secured and the benefits are enduring. But also predictable long-term revenue streams for farmers. That's the thing that concerns me, is that the focus of effort at the moment on nature recovery is going to lead us to a place where we've got pockets of rewilding in the absence of that coherence and resilience we need at a landscape and catchment scale, and that can only be achieved by working with small third-party farmers, landholders, tenant farmers, family farmers. We're not going to achieve that resilience by working with well-capitalised estates and big landholders with the best will in the world. So that's where there is a significant gap, really, which government now needs to seize the moment on. But I go back to where I started, which is that policy framework, I think, can only be achieved given the scale of the challenge, and particularly the evolution of the regulatory framework we have to where it needs to be to really fulfil the potential of the post-Brexit environmental framework. That evolution can only be informed by the demonstration projects and the controlled environment that we were setting out to achieve back in 2020, and the collaboration with regulators, with local authorities, with public bodies and the private sector to test and to learn, but to be done at an investment scale. So I'm interested in your reflections at that point, because going back to where we started, the Green Recovery Challenge Fund grant and ELMS and tests and trials, and the extent to which the existing use of public funding, I think, still falls short, really, in terms of the scale of ambition needed to unlock that learning and those kind of controlled environments.
Yeah, and all that uncertainty is problematic in many ways. Policy uncertainty is really difficult for landowners as well as the demand side of the market, right? So you touched on the fact we'd seen that cooling of demand over the summer. Actually, there's been a lot of investment in the supply side of the market through the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, NERF. So that's been fantastic, but it's built the expectation, and that actually there's a lot of landowners that have invested time and effort into projects and gearing things up, but the demand isn't quite there yet, and that's problematic. That's difficult. And there is uncertainty over the funding around ELMS, and you saw the recent closure of SFI very suddenly. That impacted really negatively on a lot of people that had plans. They'd made financial plans around and investment plans in their business around, and that's really difficult. So you've got to have that certainty. That's so important. And the ELMS tests and trials haven't got us where we need to be yet. That we're not there yet. There's a transition that we're trying to make with public funding for public goods, but just not there yet.
And in isolation, whilst that is clearly a significant step change from the past, from where we've been coming away from with the production subsidies.
Absolutely.
And all the perverse effects that had on landscapes and nature on the ground, and indeed on the farming industry's own resilience and profitability, we don't know where that is taking us, and it's that absence of a guiding vision and purpose, I think, for the use of public funding in incentivising the farming industry, I think, which is absent, and where there does need to be a very significant reset, I think, now, in the light of the types of challenges the SFI is experiencing in terms of take-up. It's the ability to create that clear guiding vision for what the environmental land management scheme is for. And in my mind's eye, it's about enabling a transition from where the farming industry is now to the kind of vision that Minette Batters has just advocated, actually, in her review of farming profitability. It's where the farming industry can wash its own face, and based on the revenue streams that it can achieve through not just food production, but through action on nature and climate recovery, well integrated in multifunctional landscapes that retain the participants in the industry across that landscape, and the scheme itself clearly needs to reward it needs to become a hierarchy. It needs to reward that transition through the different tiers to enable then farming industries to become less dependent on that public funding and enable those revenue streams to be diversified. And that's what we're seeing in the landholders, that the vision for the farm businesses we're working with in the use cases, they're very much expecting these nature markets to kind of replicate and replace what the public subsidy envelope has provided until this point.
Yeah, they need that. It's been a really challenging year this year for farmers, really, really challenging. And I think, financially it's been difficult for many. And so the expectation is there, and we need that policy certainty now. And we need more driving on the demand side. NERF's been fantastic for the supply side, but it's not addressed the demand side, and actually that's where now some time and effort's needed to really move these things forward. But innovation doesn't happen fast. Transformation's difficult, isn't it? Any sort of transformational change takes time, and it requires really strong leadership and bravery. And I think that's what we want to see from government, isn't it? Is much stronger leadership and bravery in this space to actually start moving things forwards. And we've already been brave.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
We've taken some risks.
Yes, exactly that. So I think on the supply side, it's that looking at these nature markets to achieve a new vision for farm landscapes, and moving away from the expectation that we're going to achieve our nature recovery goals through the acquisition of land by the voluntary sector, and the great work being done by NGOs and conservation organisations and large estates. It's going to be a change in the incentives to enable the small farmers, the family farmers, the uplands farmers, the tenant farmers to play their part in that and to get a fair reward from doing so. On the demand side, for me, the missing piece is the ability for businesses like water companies to understand how they can play their part, and the opportunity to take the Environment Act targets and translate them into delivery mechanisms and obligations and incentives that drive more cost-effective investment in nature-based solutions. At the moment, for a water company, the incentives still point you to the very energy-intensive improvements in your assets and your networks. And it's that opportunity to find more creative ways of blending the different revenue streams, different funding streams available, both public and private, at a landscape scale that drove us to the catchment market concept in the first place, and I think is still there for government to take. That comes really back then to the to the role and definition of what these nature markets are for, right? It comes back to the fact that they should be here to provide a financial incentive for farmers to conserve and restore nature on their land. And nature markets, well-designed nature markets, well-governed nature markets are a tool to enable the efficient allocation of public and private funding to deliver public policy goals for the natural environment. They're not about offsets, they're not about insets, they're about how you achieve an efficient allocation of funding to achieve verified environmental improvement. And I think there's a very significant step change for policy to make to set out that very clear policy framework for nature markets then to get up at scale.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So without risk, there's no reward, and innovation always comes with risk. And I've had to become much, much braver over this time that we've been working together at EnTrade, and I've learned how to be much braver, how to do things in a different way, and we have done things in a different way. But that does come with the risk of failure, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think we've got to the point where we can be confident that we've achieved the market model that delivers a fair, efficient, and fair outcome for nature recovery, for landholders, and for credit buyers. It's the market conditions that aren't quite right. In many ways, EnTrade was just always risked being ahead of its time. And without the policy framework that establishes clear policy for the role of these nature markets in delivering joined up objectives for cleaner water, nature recovery, flood reduction on the ground, and clear regulatory drivers that's going to generate the demand in these markets, it's going to be very hard for these nature markets to scale. So there is definitely a lot we can take from the achievements we've delivered, and in particular the use cases, the legacy of the data, the evidence that we'll continue to generate through the projects, our feed into policy. And it's now, I think, down to government to establish the market conditions that will enable these nature markets to be scaled, and to establish what needs to be a very different approach to financing kind of nature recovery, because we can't achieve government's nature recovery objectives through the field by field, farm by farm, regulator by regulator approach that has got us to this point to date.
Yeah, absolutely. We need demand at scale. And it's been really, really fantastic to reflect back over the last 5 years just in this conversation. And it just reminds me how far we've come and how much has been achieved, and how many people have already collaborated together to get to this point, and the great work that we've done. And I think we've set something up really well for the future, and we've shown how it could be done. There will be more things that could be done around that, different ways to do things. There's always another way of doing things, always a way to improve, and that continuous improvement journey definitely continues. But what next for EnTrade?